Burrell. He is associate professor at the Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. He just moved there last year. He had been at Burman, and he has his PhD from Stellenbosch University, the oldest university in South Africa. We're really glad that you can be here to present The Woman in the Wilderness and Other Tales, a reassessment of the Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of Revelation 12.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here. Revelation 12 is fundamental to Seventh-day Adventist identity. Verse 17 in particular is the theological basis for Adventists' claim to being the remnant church, God's final covenant community with an end-time worldwide mission. A direct connection is thus made between the woman in Revelation 12 and the Adventist movement by way of a linear genealogical descent. The woman is generally understood to be a prophetic outline of the history of the Christian church, encompassing the entire Christian era, from the first century to the present. Genealogically, the woman of Revelation 12 represents the church of the Old Testament, which gives birth to the Christ child. She then morphs into the persecuted church during the era of papal supremacy, 538 to 1798. This is the period of the church in the wilderness, best represented by the Israel of the Alps, the Waldenses of the Piedmont valleys. This persecuted church eventually begets Protestantism, and specific to our subject, that branch of British nonconformist Protestantism called Puritanism. In the Adventist prophetic outline, the church of the wilderness also constitutes the Puritans, who, like the Waldenses, escaped persecution to another wilderness, not the Piedmont valleys like the former, but to the wilderness of America, seeding God's truth in a new fertile soil. As Ari Anderson writes approvingly, secluded places such as the Piedmont valleys and the Alpine mountain fastnesses, even the friendly land of young America, all became havens of refuge for the persecuted people of God. Thus, from the Puritan seeding sprung forth Millerism and ultimately Adventism. Adventists' hermeneutical connection to the woman of Revelation 12 is therefore not only historical and geographic, but also genealogical and prophetic. Seventh-day Adventists identify as the remnant of her seed, of the woman's end-time commandment-keeping offspring. It is the contention of this paper that this interpretation of Revelation 12, however oversimplified here, is not only self-aggrandizing and characteristically mythological, but critically, it sacralizes the settling of America as divine ordinance instead of seeing British colonialism in the broader context of European imperial competition. In this imperial context, the analogy of the woman in the wilderness was a cardinal trope in Protestant colonial ideology. Adventist prophetic identity thus reflects an uncritical Eurocentrism, which centralizes British imperialism while remaining completely oblivious to its cataclysmic impact on indigenous peoples and their environment. However, a critical scrutiny of this distinctly Adventist reading of Revelation 12 upends this self-aggrandizing portrayal and demands a more biblically centered understanding of this important prophetic pericope. Nations often construct mythologies about their origins. Mythologies are narratives which provide a unifying ideology for a people's identity, sense of significance, and purpose. Mythology gives meaning to and legitimation for a nation's existence. The United States typifies this mythologizing, for the telling of its founding is rooted in ideologies of providential theory, which envisions the nation's birth and development as divinely determined outcomes. It is now widely understood that Puritanism played a fundamental role in the mythology that underpins America's self-conception. That mythology is grounded in notions of divine election, providential theory, and a special destiny. The Puritans believed their American colonies were divinely ordained to bring about the eschatological kingdom. They envisioned themselves as a chosen people, a new Israel, and the land to which they were directed by the divine hand as the promised land of New Canaan. Their model, city on a hill, vested the American imagination with a sense of divine destiny. As Leonard Sweet helpfully reminds us, the Puritans seeded New England with notions of chosen, covenanted people that took deep rootage in New World soil. Christopher Lease likewise notes that New England is a seat of transfer from Old England's providential historiography into more modern ideological presumptions like American exceptionalism and manifest destiny. Finally, Malcolm Bull and Keith Lockhart emphasized that from its beginning, America had used the framework of Christian eschatology to describe itself as a nation apart, chosen by God and destined for a special purpose. Thus, the myth of American exceptionalism was sown in Puritan New England and has flowered in the collective imagination ever since. Like nations, religious traditions often galvanize around a common identity, purpose, and mission. Religious mythologies, too, provide legitimation for a group's existence. The interpretation of Revelation 12, as described earlier, is such a mythology. It serves to legitimize the existence of Seventh-day Adventism. This religious mythology, moreover, employs some of the same tropes that undergirds the national identity. The connection between Adventism and Puritanism has been made time and again within Adventist denominational scholarship. That Adventism was birthed on the shores of New England was no accident. Adventists make multiple claims of descent from the Puritans: genealogical, geographic, and of course, theological. So as it turns out, Puritanism is the fountainhead of both American exceptionalism and Adventist exceptionalism. But as Lockhart and Bold have surmised that since from the Adventist perspective, it was not possible to have two chosen entities in America, Adventism summarily dismissed America's claim to divine election in order to uphold its own. Here we see competing claims of providential theory and manifest destiny, evidence that Adventist theology deeply imbibed the mythology of American exceptionalism and the religious ethos that gave birth to it. So let us take a closer look at this myth-making. According to the story, the flame of the gospel, or the flame of gospel truth, passed from the apostles to various wilderness communities in Europe during the Middle Ages, chief among them being the Waldenses of the Alps. The flame was kept burning by the reformers, particularly Calvinists, who received it from the Waldenses. It was subsequently taken across the English Channel to lighten the Puritan lamp. Upon fleeing their native land, pilgrims and Puritans in turn took the flame across the ocean and ultimately bequeathed it to Millerism, which then passed it on to Seventh-day Adventists, the current keepers of the flame. Thus, the apostolic flame has been kept burning in all ages. It has passed on successively to different vessels of truth and has never been extinguished. Consequently, there is a venerable genealogy of flame keepers to whom Adventists are connected prophetically, spiritually, and paternally. Like their forebears, early Adventists too found themselves in the wilderness of America, where their movement became a testament to God's protective care over His truth keepers. Though admittedly, this is a remarkable and epic tale of the survival of apostolic truth in unbroken succession, I argue again that this is a theological construction, a religious mythology, which follows a venerable Protestant tradition of claiming spiritual ancestors in the distant past. The ultimate aim of this mythology, of course, is to legitimize the Adventist claim to being the final link in this unbroken chain of light bearers. The Reformers attempted to demonstrate an unbroken succession of faithful saints going back to apostolic times as a counterpoint to the Catholic claim of exclusive apostolic succession. As Ewan Cameron puts it, quote, "The basic Protestant claim was that the existence and survival of the Waldenses, along with that of other heretics, such as the Albigenses, the Lollards, the Hussites, proved that the true church, as foretold by prophecy, had not always existed in the Church of Rome, which had been taken over by Antichrist. This sanctified tradition of descent showed that the Reformers were continuing and amplifying the work of those who had kept the true church alive for centuries, not breaking away to form something new." End of quote. Following this Protestant exemplar of denying doctrinal innovation, i.e. heresy, Adventism too has desired to see itself in the context of its theological ancestry, and not merely as a late occurrence in the development of Christian thought. Adventists have thus self-consciously situated themselves as the heirs of pure gospel truth with direct ties to apostolic Christianity. We are tied inseparably into his unbroken line of witnesses, Froome wrote, and heralds of saving truth covering the entire Christian era. But the problem with this succession narrative the problems are legion. I can only attempt to address a few of them here, and only briefly. First, the notion of truth passing through successive channels until it arrives at its final destination is a view that essentializes truth as timeless and bounded. It is a thing which is singular and immutable, ordained to be recovered or conserved by individual actors at a time. Significantly, the very channels employed as its repositories, Waldenses, Calvinists, Puritans, Millerites, do not retain the truth. Rather, they are temporary bearers who must pass it on to the next in line, having failed to go on to perfection in doctrine, to quote Froome again. They're merely heralds of present truth. For instance, even though the Waldensians joined the Protestant Reformation some 300 years before the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, And though their churches are still in existence today, the pure truth does not remain with these faithful ones. Their time as heralds of truth is relegated to the pre-Reformation era. They necessarily had to relinquish the truth to the Calvinists. Having been passed on to Calvinism, the flame of truth did not remain in Geneva, or even in the Reformed tradition broadly, though Reformed theology is still alive and well today. No, it necessarily had to cross the English Channel into the safekeeping of Puritanism. Puritans and Pilgrims then brought the light of truth across the ocean to lighten the wilderness of America. But only that Puritanism, which left England for the Americas, is counted as the woman in the wilderness. The tens of thousands of Puritans who remained in Britain, fomenting the English Civil War, decapitating Charles I in 1649, establishing a doomed Republican government under Cromwell, and engaging in the brutal conquest of the Irish who dared to resist Puritanism. This type of Puritanism does not seem to count as part of the persecuted church in the wilderness. The truth thus abandoned the old world, migrating with the Puritans who had escaped their native land and was subsequently planted in the soil of the New World. But alas, the light of truth would go out, even for Puritanism, but not before its dying embers were placed on the doorsteps of Millerism and one of Puritan's many offspring. And from among the various progeny of Millerism itself, Sabbatarian Adventists were the chosen vessel, the last and final in the series of unbroken witnesses called to revive its flames. Strangely, the proclamation of gospel truth does not seem to rest long with any particular herald, but must inevitably be delivered to the next in the line of transition. These truth keepers are left by the wayside, swallowed up in the errors of Babylon, as it were, while present truth moves on to the next chosen vessel. These various gospel trade-ins are like performers on a stage, each one making a brief appearance to play her part, but must inevitably exit the stage and leave the denouement to the final actor. That grand finale, the full restoration of apostolic truth, has been left to a single special performer who only appears at the end of this serial drama, Seventh-day Adventism. I'm being deliberately satirical here as a means of demonstrating that this whole enterprise is patently contrived. It smacks of ideology rather than anything resembling biblical exegesis. In other words, to construct a doctrine of unbroken interconnection between apostolic faith and Adventism is a highly selective process that privileges certain aspects of history while ignoring a mass of information that either does not fit with this neat picture or altogether contradicts it. That this whole line of argument attempts to stretch the evidence beyond its limits in order to prove that the chain actually links up. This is the case, for example, with the Waldenses. While Protestants have also claimed other groups in the wilderness as their forerunners, none has suited the aims of Adventist identity, none has been more emphasized in Adventist theology than the Waldenses. Adventists have claimed a special affinity with this putative connecting link between apostolicity and the Reformation. And while there is much to commend about the history of descent, survival, tenacity, and piety of the Waldenses, nevertheless, a massive accretion of hagiography has been built up around their origin, martyrdom, and doctrinal unity and purity. Time does not permit a detailed exploration of these themes, but suffice it to say that in Protestant Catholic polemical wars about spiritual genealogy, the Waldenses were used, misused, and abused by each side alike. For example, despite apologetic claims to the contrary, scholars are now universally agreed that Waldensian history does not predate Peter Waldo of Lyons, who converted to Catholicism around 1160, but broke with the church some 10 years later and attracted a following. And this fact alone controverts Protestants' claim of apostolic continuity up to the Reformation. Further, though the Waldenses undoubtedly endured a long history of persecution and suffered brutal massacres on multiple occasions, still the amplified martyrological and pacifist tradition surrounding them belie the fact that the Waldenses are historically known for vigorous resistance to persecution. They characteristically defended themselves from their persecutors and on occasions even launched counterattacks against their Catholic rivals. Equally, notions of their pure doctrines are now indefensible. Doctrinal issues in part account for the massive effort Geneva expended in their conversion to the Reformed faith between the 1550s and the 1570s. But again, this is all I can say on this subject. Let me return to the issue of the church in the wilderness, the main emphasis of this paper. As we've seen, long before Adventists characterized themselves in such terms, the Puritans had equated their own experience with this wilderness church. Persecuted by an English church that showed greater fealty to Catholicism than the ideals of Reformed Protestantism, some Puritans had fled to the wilderness, first to Holland and then to the American wilderness, as noted earlier. But the conception of America as a wilderness was another useful mythology that justified the rapacious land grab that would characterize the entire colonial period. By imagining the land as a wilderness, biblical notions of cultivation were deployed to disqualify the indigenous inhabitants of their inalienable right to the land. Indeed, the construct of a wilderness was contrived precisely to obliterate the agency of the native inhabitants, since wilderness connotes terra nullius. Puritans could thus present themselves as cultivators of an empty land rather than colonizers of occupied lands. In this regard, the notion of the American wilderness has served as a powerful trope in colonial land acquisition. It is through the power of wilderness and cultivation narratives that indigenous natural ecologies are transferred to the colonizers. By couching the invaders as the true church in the wilderness, fleeing persecution, Puritan narratives disguise the brutal character of the English colonizing project. For no sooner had the persecuted woman arrived on American shores, she too becomes a persecutor, violently uprooting the indigenous people for the glory of God. The true church dispossessed numerous indigenous tribes of New England through land conquest and genocidal wars. Even the destructive forces of European diseases like smallpox and measles were to the Puritans divinely ordained instrument to clear our title to what we possess. Furthermore, the trope of the woman in the wilderness is a theological refuge, concealing the exploitation of African slaves in Puritan New England, working to build their new empire of God, and whose enslavement was yet again justified by recourse to Scripture. Gabriella Friedman summarizes this colonial Leisure of the Men when she writes, "Reading the so-called New World as a wilderness served as European colonists' justification for brutally exploiting the land, attempting to destroy its native peoples, and establishing the transatlantic slave trade, which created a labor force to work the stolen land. In short, for the intertwining forces of the colonizing project." The ironies and contradictions are too patent for anyone but whose interest it serves not to see these narratives of wilderness, divine destiny, chosenness, etc. as imperial ideologies parading in religious vestments. The notion of wilderness validated the expropriation of countless millions of indigenous people under the unremitting expansion of Euro-American settler colonialism. Emphatically then, the trope of the woman in the wilderness is the mythology of the conquerors, and their mythology is now enshrined in Adventist theology. Adventist prophetic understanding of themselves from Revelation 12 is a patent and uncritical acceptance of Puritan notions of chosenness, providential theory, and divine destiny. In this way, Adventists have perpetuated Euro-American founding myths in their theology about their own chosen status. Adventists are indeed the offspring of Puritanism. Their theology bears witness of this. Finally, and most critically, these colonial theologies disguise the rabid competition for imperial possession that was carried on by Spain, France, Britain, and among other imperial actors. The Puritans' charter to New England, or the Puritans' charters to New England and others like it, must be seen in this wider context of an imperial race to which England was but a newcomer in the early 17th century. Britain had a vested interest in the rapid occupation of newly acquired territory, even if the first steps meant encouraging the migration of dissidents or even sending convicts in some instances. But it is better to see one's actions as part of a divine plan to establish the kingdom of God, rather than as part of an imperial strategy to expand British territories against rival claims by other European entities. And for this purpose, biblical narratives were readily available and easily deployed to construct a facade for imperial ambitions. Empires are masters of obfuscation, couching their histories of dispossession, brutality, and avarice in religious garb. Empire violently co-opts narratives of suffering and transforms them into ideologies of imperial triumph. The woman in the wilderness, as understood in Euro-American history, is an illustration of imperial theology at its worst. One which seeks to legitimize empire and its violent history as the outworking of divine providence to bring about God's kingdom on earth. Here the British Empire co-opts Israel's story of martyrdom and suffering. It twists the logic so that the oppressor becomes the oppressed. The conquerors become divine agents of redemption. These theologies of European exceptionalism, whether British, Puritan, American, or Adventist, are all imperial ideologies which centralizes Europe and America and their entangled histories of imperialisms. These theologies display the all-encompassing power of empire to co-opt the modalities of the vanquished, including their religion, to guide its own designs and to provide divine sanction for its actions. But let me conclude by suggesting that the woman in the wilderness, as depicted in Revelation chapter 12, is not a Euro-American story. It is not the story of empire. It is the cosmic, trans-historical story of Zion. Zion trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. Zion as mother, Zion as martyr, and Zion in exile, waiting for her redemption.
Wow.